My daughter-in-law screamed that I was dead weight and that my son agreed with the nursing home. My husband stood up, adjusted his tie, and walked over to our son. He didn't look at her. He just reached into his suit pocket and whispered something that made my daughter-in-law try to jump out the window. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Marka, and at 66 years old, I never imagined I would be sitting in my own living room listening to my daughter-in-law call me dead weight." The words hung in the air like poison gas, seeping into every corner of the room I had decorated with such care over the years. Winter stood there, her perfectly manicured hands gesturing dramatically as she spoke, her blonde hair catching the afternoon light streaming through the windows I had cleaned just that morning. "Marka, you have to understand," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "This isn't personal, it's just practical. You're 66 years old. You can barely manage the stairs anymore. And frankly, you're becoming a burden on Trevor and me." I felt my chest tighten. A burden. That's what I had become to my own son's family. Trevor sat on the edge of the coffee table, his head in his hands. My boy, who used to run to me when he scraped his knee, who would curl up next to me during thunderstorms, couldn't even look me in the eye. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Mom, maybe Winter has a point. The nursing home she found, Sunset Manor, it's really nice. They have activities, medical care on site, people your own age to socialize with." My husband Harold sat in his recliner, the same chair he'd occupied for the past 15 years since retiring from the factory. His face was unreadable, but I could see something brewing behind his steel gray eyes. He hadn't said a word since Winter had started her rehearsed speech about how I needed professional care. Professional care? I repeated, tasting the bitterness of those words. "Is that what we're calling it now?" Winter's expression hardened. She dropped the pretense of sympathy, like a mask falling to the floor. "Look, Marka, I'm trying to be nice about this, but let's be honest. You're dead weight. Trevor agrees with me about the nursing home, don't you, honey?" She turned to my son, waiting for his confirmation like a prosecutor waiting for a guilty verdict. Trevor lifted his head, and for a moment, I saw the little boy I used to tuck into bed every night. But then he nodded. He actually nodded. "I think it would be best, Mom, for everyone." The room started spinning. This was my home. The home where I had raised Trevor, where Harold and I had built our life together for over 40 years. The walls held memories of birthday parties, Christmas mornings, graduations, and quiet Sunday dinners. Now they were discussing shipping me off like an old piece of furniture they no longer wanted. "Best for everyone," I echoed, my voice cracking. "Or best for Winter?" Winter's eyes flashed with anger. "Excuse me. I'm trying to help this family, which is more than I can say for some people. Do you know how exhausting it is to constantly worry about whether you've fallen down the stairs or forgotten to turn off the stove? Trevor is stressed all the time because of you." I looked at my son, searching his face for any sign of the boy who used to defend me against playground bullies. "Is that true, Trevor? Am I really such a burden to you?" He shifted uncomfortably, still unable to meet my eyes. "It's not that simple, Mom. Winter and I have been talking, and we think this transition would be better for your health and safety. Plus, we're planning to start our own family soon and will need the space. Start their own family." The phrase hit me like a physical blow. I was being cleared out to make room for Winter's future children, the grandchildren I apparently wouldn't be worthy of knowing. Harold finally stirred in his chair, and I saw his jaw clench. He reached up and adjusted his tie, a habit he'd developed during his working years whenever he was about to deliver bad news to someone at the factory. The gesture sent a chill down my spine. "Harold," I whispered, hoping my husband of 43 years would finally speak up for me, would remind our son of all the sacrifices we'd made for him, all the love we'd poured into raising him. but Harold just looked at Winter with an expression I'd never seen before. It wasn't anger exactly, but something colder, more calculating. He stood up slowly, his 6-foot frame casting a shadow across the coffee table where Trevor sat hunched over. Winter continued her assault, emboldened by what she perceived as Harold's silence as agreement. The truth is, Marka, you're not getting any younger, and your needs are only going to increase. Trevor and I can't be your full-time caregivers. We have our own lives to live, full-time caregivers. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. I cook my own meals, clean my own house, do my own laundry. What exactly are you caring for? Don't be dramatic, Winter snapped. You know what I mean. The constant worry, the responsibility. Trevor barely sleeps at night, wondering if something's going to happen to you. I turned to my son again, desperate for him to contradict her, to tell me that wasn't true. But he just sat there, a puppet, with Winter pulling the strings. Harold walked over to where Trevor sat and placed a firm hand on our son's shoulder. Trevor finally looked up, and I saw something pass between them. Some silent communication that made Trevor's face go pale. Dad. Trevor's voice was uncertain now, the confidence Winter had given him suddenly wavering. Harold didn't respond to Trevor. Instead, he walked over to where Winter stood, her arms crossed defiantly across her chest. She had been so focused on breaking me down that she hadn't noticed the change in Harold's demeanor. Winter, Harold said quietly, his voice carrying the same authority it had when he was supervising crews at the factory. There's something you should know. Winter's eyebrows rose clearly, expecting Harold to finally voice his agreement with her plan. Oh, what's that, Harold? Harold reached into his suit jacket pocket, the same pocket where he always kept his reading glasses and the small notebook he used to jot down grocery lists. But what he pulled out wasn't either of those things. It was a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age and worn at the edges, as if it had been handled many times over the years. Winter's eyes fixed on it, and I saw a flicker of something uncertain cross her face for the first time since she'd started her campaign to remove me from my own home. Harold unfolded the paper, slowly, deliberately, his eyes never leaving Winter's face. This changes everything, he said simply. Winter tried to maintain her composure, but I could see her hands trembling slightly. What is that supposed to be? Harold looked down at the paper, then back at Winter. When he spoke, his voice was so quiet that we all had to lean in to hear him. But the words he whispered made Winter's face drain of all color, and for the first time since I'd known her, she was completely speechless. Trevor jumped up from the coffee table, staring at his father in shock. Dad, are you serious? Is that real? Harold nodded grimly. As real as the deed to this house. I didn't understand what was happening, but I could see that whatever Harold had just revealed had shifted the entire balance of power in the room. Winter's confident stance had crumbled, and she was backing toward the door as if she suddenly needed to escape. But it was too late. Harold had already spoken, and the words hung in the air between us like a bomb waiting to explode. Whatever my husband had been hiding, whatever that paper contained, it was about to change everything. Winter's voice came out as barely a whisper, all her earlier bravado gone. You can't be serious. Harold's smile was cold as winter itself. Oh, but I am. The silence that followed Harold's revelation stretched for what felt like hours, though it was probably only seconds. Winter's face had gone from confident to confused to absolutely terrified in the span of a heartbeat. She kept staring at that piece of paper as if it might burst into flames. I need some air. Winter finally managed her voice shaky. She practically ran from the living room, and I heard the front door slam behind her moments later. Trevor remained frozen where he stood, his mouth slightly open, looking between his father and the door where his wife had just fled. Dad, what just happened? What was on that paper? Harold carefully refolded the document and placed it back in his pocket. We'll discuss it later, son. Right now, I think you need to have a long conversation with your wife about what she's been telling you. Trevor's face flushed red. What do you mean I think you know exactly what I mean? Harold's voice was stern but not unkind. When did you start believing that your mother was a burden, Trevor? Because I've been living in this house for 43 years and I've never seen her as anything but capable and independent. The question hung in the air like an accusation. Trevor shifted uncomfortably, running his hands through his hair, a nervous habit he'd had since childhood. Winter's been worried, he said weakly. She says Mom's getting forgetful. That she's found the stove left on a couple times. That she's been walking into walls. I felt a chill run down my spine. Trevor, I have never left the stove on, and I certainly haven't been walking into walls. When did Winter tell you these things? Trevor looked genuinely confused now, as if he was trying to remember conversations that suddenly seemed less clear than they had before. She mentioned it a few weeks ago, and then again last week. She seemed really concerned. Harold and I exchanged glances. In 43 years of marriage, we developed a way of communicating without words. And right now, Harold's expression told me that he'd suspected something like this all along. Son Harold said gently, "Has Winter been the only one telling you these things about your mother? Have you actually witnessed any of these incidents yourself?" The color drained from Trevor's face as the implication of the question sank in. I know. But Winter wouldn't lie about something like that. Why would she? That was exactly the question I'd been asking myself for months. Why would Winter lie? What did she gain from convincing Trevor that I was becoming incompetent? After Trevor left to find Winter Harold, and I sat in our living room in stunned silence. The afternoon light was fading, casting long shadows across the room, and I felt like I was seeing my own home through new eyes. "Harold," I said quietly. "What was on that paper?" My husband looked older than his 68 years as he sank back into his recliner. The strong, authoritative man who had just faced down our daughter-in-law suddenly seemed tired. "Something I'd hoped I'd never have to use," he said. "But Marka, we need to talk. There are things about Winter that you don't know. Things I've been investigating for months." Investigating. The word felt strange in my mouth. What kind of investigating? Harold was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with something that sounded like guilt. "I've been suspicious of Winter for a while now. Little things at first, the way she always seemed to know exactly what buttons to push with Trevor. How quickly she'd managed to isolate him from his old friends. But then I started noticing other things." He pulled out his small notebook, the one I'd always assumed was for grocery lists and appointment reminders. But as he flipped through the pages, I saw it was filled with dates, times, and detailed notes written in Harold's careful handwriting. June 15th, he read. "Winter tells Trevor that Marcia left the coffee pot on all night. Marcia was at her book club until 10 p.m. that evening and turned off the coffee pot before leaving at 7 p.m. I checked the pot myself when she left. My heart started racing. You've been keeping track." July 2nd. "Winter mentions to Trevor that I've been finding you confused in the middle of the night wandering the house. Truth is, you sleep like a rock and haven't gotten up in the middle of the night in years except for the bathroom." Harold continued reading from his notebook, and with each entry, the picture became clearer. Winter had been systematically building a case against my mental competence, creating incidents that had never happened, symptoms I'd never displayed. But why would she do that? I asked, though, even as I spoke, pieces were starting to fall into place in my mind. Harold's jaw tightened. "That's what I've been trying to figure out. So 3 weeks ago, I hired someone to look into Winter's background." The words hit me like a physical blow. "You hired a private investigator?" I had to, Marka. "Something wasn't right about all this. Winter was too eager to get you into that nursing home. Too quick with stories about your supposed decline. It felt calculated." Harold stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the yard we'd tended together for decades. "The investigator called me yesterday with his preliminary findings." Winter's financial situation isn't what she's led Trevor to believe. What do you mean she has significant debts? Credit cards, student loans from a degree she never finished, medical bills from before she met Trevor. She's been hiding it all from him. I felt sick to my stomach. How much debt? Harold turned back to face me, his expression grim. Over $80,000. The number hung between us like a death sentence. $80,000. No wonder Winter was so eager to get me out of the house. But there had to be more to it than that. Harold, that still doesn't explain why she wants me in a nursing home. Even if she has debt, how does that benefit her? My husband's expression grew even darker. That's where it gets complicated, Marcia. And that's where that paper I showed Winter comes in. Harold walked over to the old secretary desk that had belonged to his mother, the one where we kept important papers. He pulled out a folder I'd seen him looking through several times over the past few weeks, but had assumed was related to his retirement benefits. "Do you remember your Aunt Lucille?" he asked. I frowned, confused by the sudden change of subject. Of course, Mom's sister. She died about 5 years ago. She never married, no children. Why? Harold opened the folder and pulled out several official-looking documents. Because she left everything to you, Marca. Her house, her savings, her investments, everything. The room seemed to tilt sideways. That's impossible. I would have known. There would have been lawyers, paperwork, notifications. There were, Harold said quietly. They've been coming to the house for years, but Winter has been intercepting them. The words didn't make sense at first. My brain couldn't process what Harold was telling me. Intercepting them, how she's been collecting our mail when she visits. Remember how she always insists on helping with little things around the house? How she always volunteers to bring in the mail or take out the trash? I thought back to Winter's visits over the past several years. She did always seem eager to help with small tasks, things that seemed thoughtful at the time. Now those gestures took on a sinister meaning. The investigator found copies of correspondence that should have come to you. Letters from Aunt Lucille's attorney, documents from the probate court, notices about property taxes on a house you own but don't know about. How much I whispered, afraid to hear the answer. Harold's voice was barely audible. Your aunt's estate was worth approximately $400,000. The number hit me like a freight train. $400,000. An inheritance I'd never known existed, stolen from me by my own daughter-in-law. But why keep it secret for so long? Why not just tell us? Harold's expression grew darker still, because Winter's been waiting for the right opportunity. She couldn't access the money while you were competent and living independently. But if you were declared mentally incompetent and placed in a nursing home, the pieces fell into place with horrifying clarity. Trevor would become my power of attorney. And as his wife, Winter would have significant influence over those decisions. She could gain access to your inheritance while you were locked away in a facility. Unable to advocate for yourself, I sank into my chair, overwhelmed by the scope of Winter's betrayal. She hadn't just been manipulating Trevor against me. She'd been systematically stealing my future, my security, my freedom. Harold, what was on that paper you showed Winter? My husband's smile was grim as he reached into his pocket again. A copy of the original inheritance documents that the investigator managed to obtain from the probate court. Winter thought she'd hidden all the evidence, but legal documents have a way of surviving. She knows that we know. She knows that we know everything. As if summoned by our conversation, I heard car doors slamming in the driveway. Through the window, I could see Trevor and Winter returning, but their body language was completely different from when they'd left. Trevor looked angry, confused, while Winter appeared to be pleading with him about something. Harold stood up and straightened his tie again. They're back. I felt a mix of fear and anticipation as footsteps approached our front door. The woman who had called me deadweight just an hour ago was about to face the consequences of years of deception and manipulation. The door opened and Trevor stepped inside first, his face a mask of confusion and betrayal. Behind him, Winter followed reluctantly, her earlier confidence completely gone. "Dad," Trevor said, his voice tight with emotion. "Winter and I need to talk to you and Mom. There are some things that need to be cleared up." Harold nodded calmly. "Yes, son, I believe there are." But as Winter's eyes met mine across the room, I could see that she wasn't ready to surrender yet. Whatever conversation she'd had with Trevor in the car, whatever lies she'd told to explain her earlier panic, she was still fighting. This wasn't over. In fact, I had the feeling it was just beginning. The tension in our living room was thick enough to cut with a knife, as Trevor and Winter settled uncomfortably on the couch. Winter kept glancing toward the door as if calculating her chances of escape, while Trevor sat rigidly, his hands clenched into fists on his knees. "Dad," Trevor began, his voice strained. "Winter says you've been investigating her behind our backs. She says you hired some kind of private detective to spy on her." Harold didn't flinch. "That's correct." The simple admission seemed to catch Trevor off guard. He'd clearly expected denials, explanations, maybe even apologies. Instead, his father's calm confirmation left him speechless for a moment. Winter jumped into the silence, her voice high and defensive. "See, I told you, Trevor, your parents don't trust me. They never have. From the day we got married, they've been looking for ways to get rid of me." I felt a familiar stab of guilt at her words. It was true that Harold and I had been cautious about Winter when Trevor first brought her home. She'd seemed too polished, too eager to please, like someone playing a role rather than being herself. But we'd attributed our unease to typical parental protectiveness. Now I realized our instincts had been right all along. "Winter," Harold said quietly, "would you like to explain to Trevor why you've been collecting our mail for the past 3 years?" The color drained from Winter's face so quickly, I thought she might faint. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Really?" Harold opened his folder again and pulled out a stack of photocopied envelopes because I have copies of 17 pieces of mail addressed to Marcia that were never delivered to her, all collected on dates when you visited our house. Trevor turned to stare at his wife, confusion written across his features. "Winter, what is he talking about?" Winter's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Those are just... I was trying to help. Your mother gets overwhelmed by paperwork sometimes, so I thought I'd help organize it for her." "Organize it?" Harold's voice was dangerously quiet. "Is that what you call hiding legal documents about a $400,000 inheritance?" The words hit the room like a bomb. Trevor's head snapped toward his father, his eyes wide with shock. "What inheritance?" Harold methodically laid out the documents on the coffee table between us. Legal papers, bank statements, property deeds, all bearing my name, all dated over the past 5 years. Your mother's aunt, Lucille, left her everything when she died. Harold explained, his voice steady and factual. The house in Portland, her savings accounts, her investment portfolio. Winter has been intercepting all the legal correspondence about it. Trevor picked up one of the documents with shaking hands, scanning the official letterhead and legal language. "Mom, did you know about this?" "Not until 20 minutes ago," I said softly. "I thought Aunt Lucille had donated everything to charity." "That's what I was told." "Told by who?" Trevor asked, though his eyes were already turning toward his wife with a look of growing horror. Winter stood up abruptly, pacing to the window and back. "This is all a misunderstanding. I was protecting Marcia from stress. Legal documents are complicated, and at her age, I thought it would be better if Trevor and I handled the estate matters." At her age, I repeated, feeling anger bubble up in my chest. "I'm 66, Winter, not 96. I've been handling my own affairs perfectly well for decades." Harold pulled out his notebook again. The one I now knew contained months of careful observations. "Trevor, I want you to think carefully about the past year. When did you first start believing that your mother was becoming forgetful or confused?" Trevor sat in silence for a long moment, his brow furrowed in concentration. Winter mentioned it first. I think she said Mom had called her 3 times in one day, asking the same question. What question? Harold asked. Trevor looked uncertain. I don't remember exactly. Something about a doctor's appointment, I think. Harold flipped through his notebook. July 28th. Winter told Trevor that Marcia called her 3 times asking about a cardiology appointment, but Marcia's cardiologist confirmed that her next appointment isn't until October, and she hasn't called his office in 6 months. Winter spun around from the window, her face flushed with anger. You investigated my conversations with Trevor. That's a violation of privacy. That's what Harold asked mildly. Thorough fact-checking, the kind any reasonable person would do when their daughter-in-law is trying to have their wife declared incompetent. The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Trevor's face had gone pale, and he was staring at Winter with an expression I'd never seen before. A mixture of betrayal and disgust. Winter, he said slowly, is it true? Have you been lying about Mom's condition? Winter's composure finally cracked completely. Tears started flowing down her cheeks, and her voice became high and desperate. I wasn't lying. I was worried. Your mother is getting older, and I thought maybe she wasn't remembering things correctly. I was trying to protect her. Protect her from what I asked, standing up to face my daughter-in-law directly. From her own inheritance, from her own home, from her own family. That's not what I was doing, Winter sobbed. I love this family. I love you and Harold. I just wanted what was best for everyone. Harold's voice cut through her tears like ice. What was best for everyone, or what was best for you and your $80,000 in debt? The room went dead silent. Trevor's mouth fell open and he turned to stare at his wife with complete shock. $80,000, Winter. What is he talking about? Winter's sob stopped abruptly, replaced by a look of pure panic. Trevor, I can explain. It's not what it sounds like. Then what is it? Trevor's voice was rising now, anger replacing confusion. Because it sounds like you've been lying to me about everything, about Mom, about money, about our entire marriage. Harold pulled out another set of documents from his folder. Credit card statements, student loan records, medical bills dating back to before you and Trevor met. Winter has been hiding significant financial obligations from you, son. Trevor snatched the papers from his father's hands, his eyes scanning the numbers with growing horror. Winter, these bills, some of these are from 5 years ago. We've been married for 3 years. Why didn't you tell me about any of this? Winter collapsed back onto the couch, her head in her hands. I was embarrassed. I thought I could handle it myself. I thought once we were married, once I had access to your family's resources. Our family's resources, I interrupted. Is that what this is about? You married Trevor for money. No. Winter's head shot up, her eyes wild with desperation. I love Trevor, but yes, I needed help. And I thought your family had money. And maybe if we all lived together, if we combined resources. Harold's laugh was cold and bitter. Our resources, Winter, were retired factory workers, living on Social Security and a modest pension. The only significant money in this family is your mother-in-law's inheritance that you've been trying to steal. The word steal seemed to hit Winter like a physical blow. She flinched and looked around the room as if searching for an escape route that didn't exist. I wasn't stealing anything, she whispered. I was just managing it, making sure it was handled properly, by hiding it from the person who inherited it, Harold asked. By trying to have that person declared incompetent. So, you could gain control of the money. Trevor was staring at the financial documents, shaking his head slowly. Winter, this debt, this is massive. These minimum payments alone are more than I make in a month. How are you planning to pay for all this? Winter's silence was answer enough. She'd been planning to use my inheritance to pay off her debts, and the only way to access that money was to get me out of the way. Harold reached into his jacket pocket once more, pulling out the same yellowed paper he'd shown Winter earlier. But this time, he unfolded it completely and laid it on the coffee table for all of us to see. It wasn't just an inheritance document, it was a will amendment, one that I'd never seen before, written in Aunt Lucille's careful handwriting. "Your aunt was a smart woman, Marka," Harold said softly. "She suspected that someone might try to take advantage of you after her death, so she included a very specific clause in her will." I leaned forward to read the document, my heart pounding. The language was formal and legal, but one paragraph stood out clearly. "Should any person attempt to manipulate, coerce, or defraud Marcia Eleanor Hutchins regarding this inheritance through false claims of mental incompetence or any other means, said inheritance shall immediately transfer to a charitable trust, and the offending party shall be subject to prosecution for fraud." Winter's face went absolutely white as the implications sank in. Not only had she failed to gain access to my inheritance, but her attempts to steal it had just triggered a clause that would take it away from me entirely unless we could prove her fraud. Trevor set down the financial documents and looked at his wife with an expression of complete revulsion. "You weren't just trying to steal from my mother, you were willing to have her locked away in a nursing home to do it." Winter started sobbing again, but this time there was no sympathy in the room for her tears. "Trevor, please, you have to understand. I was desperate. The creditors were calling every day. I thought I was going to lose everything. So you decided to destroy my family instead." Trevor stood up, towering over his wife. "You made me believe my own mother was losing her mind. You almost convinced me to abandon her when she needed me most." Harold folded up Aunt Lucille's will amendment and placed it back in his pocket. "The good news is that your aunt anticipated this possibility. The fraud clause can be reversed if we can provide evidence that Winter's actions were deliberate and malicious." He gestured to the stack of documents on the coffee table, which we can. Winter looked around the room at all of us, her eyes wild with panic. She knew she'd been caught, knew that all her careful manipulation had unraveled. But I could see her mind working, searching for some last desperate play. "You can't prove anything," she said, suddenly her voice gaining strength. "Those are just coincidences. Maybe I did help with the mail, but I was trying to be helpful. Maybe I was worried about Marcia's memory, but that's just being a caring daughter-in-law. You can't prove I was trying to steal anything." Harold's smile was cold as he pulled out his phone. "Actually, Winter, we can." He pressed a button and suddenly Winter's own voice filled the room. Tiny but clearly recognizable through the phone speaker. "The old lady's getting suspicious. We need to move faster on the nursing home thing. Once she's declared incompetent, Trevor can sign the papers and we'll have access to the whole inheritance. 400,000 should be enough to pay off the cards and still have plenty left over." The blood drained from Winter's face as her own words condemned her. "Where did you get that? You can't record people without their permission." "I didn't record you," Harold said calmly. "Your friend Madison did. Turns out she's not as loyal as you thought. The private investigator approached her last week, and she was very cooperative once she understood the legal implications of helping someone commit fraud." Winter collapsed back onto the couch, finally understanding that she had no way out. Every lie had been exposed, every manipulation revealed. She was finished. But as I looked at my devastated son and my heartbroken husband, I realized that Winter's defeat was only the beginning. The damage she'd done to our family would take much longer to repair than it had taken to expose her crimes. Trevor was staring at his wife as if she were a stranger, which in many ways she was. "Who are you?" he whispered. "I don't even know who I married." Winter's response was so quiet, I almost didn't hear it. Someone who didn't have any other choice, but we all knew that wasn't true. Winter had made her choices, and now she would have to live with the consequences. The silence that followed Harold's bombshell recording stretched for what felt like an eternity. Winter sat frozen on our couch, her face ashen, staring at Harold's phone as if it were a venomous snake. Trevor had backed away from his wife until he was pressed against the wall. looking like a man who'd just discovered he'd been living with a stranger for 3 years. I felt numb, disconnected from the scene unfolding in my own living room. Hearing Winter's voice so casually discussing my manipulation, referring to me as the old lady planning to steal my inheritance, was like watching a horror movie where I was the victim. Winter. Trevor's voice was barely a whisper. Tell me that wasn't you on that recording. Winter's mouth opened and closed several times before any sound came out. Trevor, you don't understand. I never meant for it to go this far. I was scared. Scared of what Trevor's voice was getting stronger, angrier. Scared of being honest with your husband, scared of working to pay off your own debts instead of stealing from my mother. Harold pocketed his phone and pulled out yet another document from his seemingly endless folder. I'm afraid it gets worse, son. Trevor's face went even paler. Worse. How could it possibly get worse? Harold glanced at me, and I saw something in his eyes that made my stomach clench with dread. Marcia, do you remember when your doctor wanted to increase your blood pressure medication last month? I frowned, confused by the sudden change of subject. Yes, but I told him I'd been feeling fine. My readings at home were normal, so we decided to keep the current dosage. And do you remember who suggested you start checking your blood pressure at home in the first place? The question hit me like a physical blow. Winter, I whispered. She said she was worried about my health, that she'd bought a home monitor for me to use. Harold nodded grimly and handed me the new document. It was a receipt from a medical supply store dated 6 months ago. Winter had indeed purchased a blood pressure monitor, but she'd also bought something else. A bottle of medication that would artificially raise blood pressure readings. The investigator found this receipt in Winter's car, Harold explained, along with instructions she'd printed from the internet on how to tamper with blood pressure readings. Trevor snatched the receipt from my hands, his face contorting with rage as he read it. She was drugging you. She was actually poisoning you to make you seem sick. Winter jumped up from the couch, her hands raised defensively. It wasn't poison, it was harmless. Just something to make the readings a little higher so the doctor would be more concerned. I thought if there was medical evidence that Marcia was declining. You thought you'd create false medical evidence to support having me declared incompetent? I finished my voice surprisingly steady despite the rage building inside me. Winter's face crumpled. I wasn't trying to hurt you, Marca. I would never actually hurt you. I just needed the doctor to take my concerns seriously. Harold's voice was ice cold. What other medical concerns did you manufacture, Winter? Because the investigator found quite a bit of internet research on your computer about simulating symptoms of dementia and cognitive decline. The room started spinning around me. Winter hadn't just been lying about my behavior. She'd been actively trying to make me appear mentally incompetent. The blood pressure tampering was just the beginning. Trevor Harold continued. Do you remember the incident 3 weeks ago when Winter said she found your mother wandering confused in the grocery store parking lot? Trevor nodded, his face grim. She said Mom didn't recognize her at first and seemed disoriented. I was never in any grocery store parking lot 3 weeks ago, I said firmly. I was at my book club meeting from 6 o'clock to 9 that evening. And then I came straight home. Harold pulled out his notebook again. I checked with the book club. 5 women confirmed that Marcia was there the entire evening, participating normally in discussions about the novel they'd read. No confusion, no disorientation. Winter's breathing was becoming rapid and shallow, like a cornered animal. You're twisting everything. Maybe I got the dates confused. Maybe it was a different day. Maybe, Harold said coldly. You made the entire thing up. Just like you made up the story about Marcia calling you repeatedly with the same questions. Just like you made up the story about her leaving appliances on. Just like you made up every single concern you ever raised about her mental state. Trevor was staring at his wife with an expression of complete horror. Winter, you've been systematically destroying my mother's reputation and health for months. You made me believe she was losing her mind when the only thing wrong with her was that you were poisoning her. Winter fell back onto the couch, her whole body shaking. I needed the money, Trevor. You don't understand how much debt I was in. The creditors were threatening to sue me to garnish my wages, to ruin my credit permanently. So you decided to ruin my mother's life instead. Trevor's voice was getting dangerously loud. You decided to have her locked away in a nursing home based on lies and manufactured medical evidence. Harold cleared his throat, drawing our attention back to him. There's something else you need to know, Trevor, about the nursing home Winter selected. My heart sank. There was more. Harold pulled out his phone again and scrolled through what looked like email correspondence. Sunset Manor, the facility Winter was so eager to have Marcia admitted to, has a very specific policy about resident assets and estate planning. Trevor frowned. What kind of policy? Upon admission, residents are strongly encouraged to sign financial power of attorney documents, giving the facility and the residents immediate family control over all assets. It's supposed to be for simplified billing and care management. I felt sick to my stomach. And once those papers were signed, Harold's expression was grim. Winter, as Trevor's wife, would have had significant influence over decisions regarding your assets. The inheritance money could have been transferred to accounts she had access to within weeks of your admission. Winter's sobs were becoming hysterical now. I wasn't going to steal it all. I just needed enough to pay off the debts. The rest would have been saved for Trevor and our future children. Our future children, Trevor's voice cracked with emotion. You were willing to destroy my relationship with my mother, have her drugged and institutionalized, steal her inheritance, and you thought I'd want to have children with you after that. Winter looked up at Trevor with desperate, pleading eyes. Trevor, please, I love you. I made terrible mistakes, but I love you. We can work through this. I'll get help. I'll pay back every penny. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. Trevor shook his head slowly, backing further away from his wife. There is no making this right, Winter. You didn't just steal money or tell lies. You tried to steal my mother's entire life. You tried to steal my relationship with her. You made me complicit in abusing my own mother. The last words came out as a choked whisper, and I saw tears forming in my son's eyes. The guilt he was feeling, the realization of how close he'd come to abandoning me based on Winter's lies, was eating him alive. I stood up and walked over to Trevor, placing my hand on his arm. This is not your fault, I said firmly. She manipulated you just as much as she manipulated me. But I should have known, Trevor said, his voice breaking. I should have questioned what she was telling me. I should have spent more time with you, observed for myself, instead of just believing her stories. Harold joined us, placing his hand on Trevor's shoulder. Son Winter is clearly a skilled manipulator. She had months to plan this, and she was very careful about how she presented information. You trusted your wife, which is what husbands are supposed to do. Winter was watching our family moment with increasing desperation. Trevor, please don't let them turn you against me. Yes, I made mistakes, but I'm your wife. We took vows, for better or worse, remember. Trevor turned to look at his wife, and the expression on his face made her recoil. For better or worse doesn't include fraud, elder abuse, and attempted theft of $400,000. Winter, there are limits to what marriage vows can cover. Harold pulled out one final document from his folder, and I could tell from his expression that this was the worst news yet. Winter, there's something you should know about that recording of you discussing Marcia's inheritance. Winter looked up with red, swollen eyes. What about it? Madison wasn't just secretly recording you for our investigator. She was also wearing a wire for the FBI. The words hit the room like a lightning strike. Winter's face went completely white, and Trevor stumbled backward as if he'd been punched. The FBI? Trevor's voice was barely audible. Harold nodded grimly. elder abuse, mail fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud involving amounts over $100,000. These are federal crimes, Winter. The local district attorney's office has already been contacted. Winter let out a sound that was part scream, part sob. No, no, no. You can't do this to me. I'll pay everything back. I'll confess to Trevor and apologize to Marcia. I'll do whatever you want. It's too late for that, Harold said quietly. The moment you started intercepting Marcia's mail and tampering with her medical care, you crossed lines that can't be uncrossed. This isn't a family dispute anymore, Winter. This is a criminal matter. As if summoned by Harold's words, we heard car doors slamming in the driveway. Through the window, I could see 2 dark sedans parked behind Winter's car and several serious-looking people in business suits walking toward our front door. Winter saw them too and let out a wail of despair. Trevor, please don't let them arrest me. I'm your wife. But Trevor was staring at his wife with a mixture of disgust and pity that told me their marriage had died in that living room, strangled by lies and betrayal. The doorbell rang, and Harold walked calmly to answer it. I heard him speaking quietly to someone, then footsteps entering our home. A woman in a dark suit appeared in the living room doorway holding up a badge. Winter Hutchkins. I'm Agent Sarah Martinez with the FBI. You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit mail fraud and elder abuse. Winter looked around the room one last time, her eyes lingering on Trevor's face. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry, but sorry wasn't enough. Sorry couldn't undo the months of manipulation, the lies, the systematic destruction of our family's trust. Sorry couldn't give back the time I'd spent doubting myself, wondering if I was really losing my mind. As the agents led Winter away in handcuffs, Trevor collapsed into his father's arms, sobbing like the little boy he'd once been. Dad, I almost put Mom in a nursing home. I almost abandoned her because of lies. Harold held his son tightly, his own eyes wet with tears. But you didn't, Trevor. When it mattered most, you listened to the truth. I watched through the window as Winter was placed in the back of one of the sedans. Her perfectly styled hair disheveled, her designer clothes wrinkled, her mask of false perfection finally stripped away. For 3 years, she'd lived in our family like a cancer slowly destroying us from the inside. But now she was gone, and we were still here, wounded but alive, shaken but standing. The inheritance she'd tried so hard to steal was safe. More importantly, the family she'd tried to destroy was going to survive. But as I looked at my son's tear-stained face and my husband's exhausted expression, I knew our real work was just beginning. Winter's betrayal had left scars that would take time to heal, trust that would need to be rebuilt, and wounds that might never fully close. Still, for the first time in months, I felt something I'd almost forgotten. Hope. The silence that settled over our house after the FBI agents left with Winter was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It wasn't peaceful. It was the hollow quiet that follows a tornado when you're still standing, but everything around you has been destroyed. Trevor sat slumped in the same chair where Winter had delivered her ultimatum about the nursing home just hours earlier. He hadn't spoken since the agents led his wife away in handcuffs. He just stared at the coffee table, where all of Harold's evidence was still spread out like pieces of a puzzle that revealed a picture none of us had wanted to see. Harold moved around the room, methodically collecting the documents and returning them to their folder. His movements were careful, deliberate, like a man who had just completed the most difficult task of his life and wasn't sure what to do next. I found myself studying my son's face, looking for traces of the little boy who used to climb into my lap when he was scared or hurt. That boy was still there, I realized, underneath the beard and the worry lines and the weight of adult responsibility. He was still my Trevor, still the child who needed his mother's comfort when the world became too frightening to navigate alone. Mom. Trevor finally spoke, his voice rough with unshed tears. How long do you think she was planning this? I considered the question carefully. Winter's manipulation had been so gradual, so subtle, that it was hard to pinpoint when her concern for my well-being had shifted into something darker. I think it started the day she found out about Aunt Lucille's inheritance, I said quietly. She's always been good at reading people, at figuring out what they need to hear. When she realized there was money involved, everything else became secondary. Trevor picked up one of the credit card statements Harold had obtained, scanning the columns of debt that stretched back years before he'd even met Winter. Look at these dates, Mom. She was already drowning in debt when we started dating. What if she targeted me specifically because she thought my family had money? The thought had occurred to me too. But hearing Trevor voice it made it real in a way that was almost unbearable. Trevor, don't torture yourself with questions like that. Even if Winter had ulterior motives from the beginning, that doesn't change the fact that you acted out of love. Everything you did because you thought you were protecting your family. Harold finished organizing his papers and sat down heavily in his recliner. Son, there's something else you need to know. Something the investigator discovered about Winter's past relationships. Trevor's head snapped up, his eyes wide with a mixture of dread and desperate curiosity. What do you mean? Harold pulled out his phone and scrolled through what looked like an email. Winter was married before twice, actually. The investigator tracked down her previous husbands. My heart sank. Another secret. Another lie. How many layers of deception had Winter built around herself? Both marriages followed similar patterns. Harold continued, his voice clinical and detached. She would identify men from families she believed had assets, marry them quickly, then begin campaigns to isolate them from their relatives while positioning herself to inherit or control family wealth. Trevor's face went gray. Are you telling me I was just another mark, another victim in some kind of long-term con? Harold's expression softened with sympathy for his son's pain. The first husband, Robert, she convinced to cut ties with his elderly father after claiming the old man was becoming senile and needed professional care. She had him nearly ready to sign power of attorney papers when the father's lawyer got suspicious and hired an investigator. What happened? I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Robert discovered that Winter had been forging medical reports, bribing a nurse to falsify the father's mental health evaluations, and had already started transferring money out of the father's accounts. She disappeared before charges could be filed. Trevor buried his face in his hands. And the second husband, Michael, she used a different approach with him, convinced him that his mother was financially irresponsible and needed their help managing her money. By the time Michael realized what was happening, Winter had drained nearly $60,000 from his mother's retirement account. The numbers kept getting worse. $60,000 stolen from an elderly woman who probably trusted her son's wife completely. I thought about how close I had come to being in that same position, trapped in a nursing home, while Winter systematically emptied my bank accounts. Michael's mother died 2 years later, Harold added quietly, never knowing that her daughter-in-law had stolen her life savings. Trevor made a sound like a wounded animal. She's done this before multiple times, and I led her right to you, Mom. I brought a predator into our family and then helped her hunt you. I moved to sit on the arm of Trevor's chair, placing my hand on his shoulder. You couldn't have known, honey. Winter is clearly a professional manipulator. She's had years to perfect her techniques, but I should have questioned things more. Trevor insisted, his voice thick with self-remation. When she started telling me about your supposed memory problems, I should have spent more time with you myself instead of just taking her word for it. Harold leaned forward in his chair, his expression serious but kind. Trevor, do you remember when Winter first mentioned concerns about your mother's health? Trevor thought for a moment. It was after we'd been married about 6 months, I think. She said she'd noticed some small things when she visited. Little signs that Mom might be struggling more than she was letting on. And what was your first instinct when she told you that, I wanted to come over and spend more time with you and Dad? Trevor said immediately. I suggested we start having dinner here every Sunday so I could observe things myself. And what did Winter say to that suggestion? Trevor's expression grew troubled as the memory came back to him. She said it might make you feel self-conscious, like we were checking up on you. She thought it would be better if she just kept an eye on things quietly and reported back to me. Harold nodded. She isolated you from us just as effectively as she isolated us from you. Every time you wanted to verify her claims by spending more time with your mother, she had a reason why that wasn't a good idea. I remembered those months when Trevor's visits had become less frequent, more formal. At the time, I'd attributed it to the natural progression of a married man building his own life with his wife. Now I understood that Winter had been systematically cutting the ties between Trevor and his parents, making him dependent on her version of events. She played us all, I said sadly. She made you feel like you were protecting me while she was actually isolating me. She made Harold and me feel like we were losing you to your new wife when really she was stealing you from us. Trevor stood up abruptly and walked to the window, staring out at the yard where he'd played as a child. I keep thinking about all the times I could have figured it out, he said. All the red flags I ignored because I was so desperate to believe that someone like Winter could actually love someone like me. Someone like you. Harold's voice was sharp with surprise. Trevor, what do you mean by that? Trevor's laugh was bitter. Come on, Dad. I'm 31 years old. I work at a hardware store. I live in a rental duplex. And my idea of a big night out is dinner at Applebee's. When a woman like Winter, beautiful, sophisticated, seemingly successful. When someone like that shows interest in a guy like me, you don't ask too many questions. You just feel grateful. The admission broke my heart. My successful, intelligent, kind-hearted son saw himself as unworthy of love, as someone who should be grateful for whatever scraps of affection he could get. No wonder Winter had found him such an easy target. Trevor, I said firmly, you are one of the most decent, hard-working, loyal men I've ever known. Any woman would be lucky to have you in her life. Winter didn't choose you because you were an easy mark. She chose you because she recognized your good qualities and thought she could exploit them. Harold stood up and joined Trevor at the window. Son Winter's previous husbands weren't losers or failures either. Robert was an accountant with his own practice. Michael was a teacher who coached high school football in his spare time. She targets good men, men with strong family connections and moral values, because those are the men most likely to sacrifice their own interests to protect the people they love. Trevor turned away from the window, and I could see that some of the self-blame was beginning to lift from his shoulders. So what happens now? He asked, with Winter, with the charges, with everything. Harold sat back down and pulled out a business card. Agent Martinez left this for us. Winter's arraignment is scheduled for next Thursday. They're charging her with mail fraud conspiracy to commit fraud and elder abuse. Given her history with the previous marriages, she's looking at significant prison time. The reality of it hit me suddenly. Winter. The woman who had sat at my dinner table and called me dead weight, who had drugged my blood pressure medication and tried to have me declared mentally incompetent, was going to prison. The justice of it felt abstract, distant, like something happening to other people. Will we have to testify? I asked. Probably, Harold replied. The prosecutor will want us to detail the timeline of Winter's manipulation, especially the medical tampering and the intercepted mail. Trevor sat back down heavily. I can't believe I'm going to have to testify against my own wife in a criminal trial. Your soon-to-be ex-wife, Harold corrected gently. Son, you'll need to file for divorce immediately. Given the circumstances, it should be straightforward, but you'll want to protect yourself legally and financially. The practicalities of dismantling a marriage built on lies seemed overwhelming. How do you divide assets with someone who is about to go to prison for fraud? How do you explain to friends and co-workers that your wife wasn't who you thought she was? There's one more thing, Harold said, his tone suggesting this was important. Agent Martinez asked if we wanted to pursue restitution for the inheritance money Winter attempted to steal. I frowned. But she didn't actually take any of my inheritance. She just prevented me from knowing about it. True, but the attorney handling Aunt Lucille's estate says there were investment opportunities and time-sensitive decisions that should have been made over the past 5 years. By preventing you from knowing about the inheritance, winter may have cost you additional money in lost investment income and property value appreciation. The numbers were staggering when Harold explained them. The Portland house that had been sitting empty could have been rented out for approximately $1,500 per month. The investment accounts should have been actively managed rather than sitting dormant. Conservative estimates suggested that winter's interference had cost me at least $70,000 in lost income over 5 years. $70,000. Trevor repeated numbly. She didn't just try to steal your inheritance, Mom. She actually did steal money from you by preventing you from managing it properly. The scope of Winter's betrayal seemed to grow with each new revelation. She hadn't just been planning to steal my future. She had already been stealing from it for years. A soft knock at the door interrupted our conversation. Harold went to answer it and returned with a woman in a conservative business suit carrying a briefcase. "This is Miss Jennifer Walsh," Harold said. "She's the attorney who's been handling Aunt Lucille's estate. She wanted to meet with you personally to discuss the inheritance and what steps we need to take to finalize everything." Miss Walsh smiled warmly as she shook my hand. "Mrs. Hutchins, I'm so sorry for everything you've been through. Your aunt would be absolutely horrified to know that someone tried to steal her gift to you." As Miss Walsh spread out papers detailing the full extent of my inheritance, I felt overwhelmed by the enormity of it all. The Portland house was worth approximately $260,000. The investment accounts had grown to nearly $140,000, despite being poorly managed. There were also some smaller assets, jewelry, artwork, and a small collection of antique books. "Your aunt was very specific about her wishes," Miss Walsh explained. "She wanted you to have financial security in your retirement, and she wanted you to have choices about how to spend your golden years." I thought about Winter's plan to lock me away in a nursing home while she spent Aunt Lucille's money paying off credit cards for designer clothes and luxury vacations. The contrast was stark and infuriating. Trevor was studying the inheritance documents with wonder. "Mom, with this money you could travel, renovate the house, do anything you want." For the first time in hours, I smiled. "What I want is to rebuild our family. To make sure that what Winter did to us never happens again." Harold reached over and took my hand. "Then that's exactly what we'll do." As the afternoon shadows lengthened across our living room, I realized that Winter's betrayal, devastating as it had been, had also given us something precious. The knowledge of how much we truly meant to each other. She had tried to destroy our family bonds, but in the end, she had only made them stronger. But even as I felt grateful for our survival, I knew the hardest part was still ahead of us. Healing from betrayal. This deep would take time, patience, and a level of forgiveness that I wasn't sure any of us were ready for yet. 6 months later, I stood in the kitchen of the Portland house that had belonged to Aunt Lucille, watching the morning sun stream through windows that hadn't been opened in years. The house had good bones, as Harold liked to say, but it needed work. New paint, updated fixtures, some landscaping to bring the overgrown garden back to life. I decided to keep it as a weekend retreat, a place where our family could make new memories to replace the ones Winter had tried to poison. Trevor was in the backyard building a deck with his father. The sound of their laughter drifted through the open window, and I marveled at how healing that sound was after months of tension and doubt. The divorce had been finalized 3 weeks ago. Winter never contested it. She couldn't really, given that she was facing 15 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to multiple counts of fraud and elder abuse. Agent Martinez had told us that Winter's cooperation in providing information about other potential victims had earned her a reduced sentence, but she would still serve at least 8 years. Trevor struggled with guilt about feeling relieved by his wife's imprisonment. In therapy sessions that we'd all started attending together, Dr. Rebecca Foster had helped him understand that his marriage had been built on lies from the very beginning. There was nothing to mourn because the woman he thought he'd married had never really existed. "How's that deck coming along?" I called out the window. "Almost ready for the furniture you ordered," Harold called back, "though I still think you bought too many chairs." I smiled. I had deliberately ordered extra chairs for the outdoor dining set. After years of feeling like there wasn't room for me at my own family table, I wanted to make sure there would always be space for everyone who belonged in our lives. The inheritance money had given me choices I'd never expected to have at 66. I could have traveled the world, moved to a luxury retirement community, or simply invested it all and lived off the interest. Instead, I'd chosen something different. I'd chosen to rebuild. The Portland house was just one part of it. I'd also used some of the money to help Trevor make a down payment on a small house in our neighborhood. Close enough that we could see each other regularly, but far enough that he could build his own life. Harold and I had renovated our own home too, updating the kitchen where Winter had sat and called me deadweight, transforming it into a warm, welcoming space where that conversation felt like something from another lifetime. "Mom, come see this," Trevor called from the backyard. I walked outside to find them standing back to admire their handiwork. The deck was beautiful, spacious enough for the table and chairs I'd ordered with built-in planters that we'd fill with herbs and flowers, but what made my breath catch was the small plaque Harold had mounted near the door. "The Lucille Hutchins Family Retreat," it read, "where love grows stronger." "It's perfect," I whispered, tears threatening to spill over. Harold wiped sawdust from his hands and pulled me into a hug. "Your aunt would love this, Marga. She always said family was the most important inheritance anyone could receive." We heard a car pulling into the driveway, and Trevor went to investigate. A few minutes later, he returned with a young woman I'd never seen before. She was pretty in a natural way, with kind eyes and a shy smile that reminded me of Trevor when he was nervous. "Mom, Dad, I'd like you to meet Sarah Trevor," said his cheek slightly pink. "We've been seeing each other for a few weeks, and I thought it was time you met her." Sarah stepped forward and extended her hand. "Mrs. Hutchins, Mr. Hutchins, it's so nice to meet you. Trevor talks about you both constantly." I shook her hand, studying her face for any signs of the calculated charm that Winter had perfected. But Sarah's smile seemed genuine. And when she looked at Trevor, her expression held the kind of uncomplicated affection that I'd never seen Winter display. "Sarah teaches 3rd grade at the elementary school near my store," Trevor explained. "She came in looking for supplies for her classroom, and we started talking." Harold grinned. "Smart boy. Teachers are good people, honest people." Sarah laughed. "Well, I hope you still think so after you get to know me." Trevor warned me that his family is very close, and I think that's wonderful. I lost my own parents in a car accident 3 years ago, so I understand how precious family relationships are. Something about the way she said it, without drama or manipulation, just stating a simple truth about loss and love, made me instantly like her. This was what genuine emotion looked like. I realized this was how real people talked about real pain. We spent the afternoon showing Sarah around the house and the property, sharing stories about Aunt Lucille and our plans for the retreat. Sarah listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions and offering to help with some of the gardening projects I'd mentioned. As evening approached, Trevor and Sarah prepared to drive back to town. Harold was cleaning up the tools from the deck construction, and I found myself alone with Sarah for a moment. "Mrs. Hutchins," she said quietly, "I hope you don't mind me saying this, but Trevor told me about what happened with his first wife. I want you to know that I would never want to come between him and his family. If anything, I hope I can help him appreciate what he has even more." The contrast with Winter's approach couldn't have been starker. Where Winter had immediately begun working to isolate Trevor from his parents, Sarah was actively encouraging those relationships. "Call me Marcia," I said, surprising myself with how easily the invitation came. "And thank you for saying that. Trevor's been through a lot, and he deserves someone who sees his worth." Sarah's eyes grew soft. He's the most genuinely good person I've ever met. Sometimes I can't believe how lucky I am to have found him. As I watched them drive away, Trevor's arm around Sarah's shoulders, I felt a peace I hadn't experienced in years. My son was healing, learning to trust again, finding his way back to the confident, loving man he'd been before Winter's manipulation had nearly destroyed him. Harold finished putting away the tools and joined me on the new deck. We sat in the chairs I'd bought, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, taking my hand. "I'm thinking about choices," I said. Winter thought she could steal my choices by having me declared incompetent and locked away. She thought she could take away my freedom to decide how to spend my inheritance, where to live, who to trust. Harold squeezed my hand, but she couldn't. No, she couldn't. And now I have more choices than I ever imagined possible. I gestured around the property at the house that would become a gathering place for our family at the future that stretched ahead of us like an unwritten book. "There's something I need to tell you," Harold said, his tone growing serious. "I got a call from Agent Martinez yesterday. Winter wants to see you." My stomach clenched. "See me? Why?" "She says she wants to apologize, to try to make amends somehow. The warden at the federal facility where she's being held says inmates sometimes request meetings with their victims as part of their rehabilitation process." I considered this information carefully. Part of me was curious about what Winter might have to say now that all her lies had been exposed and she was facing the consequences of her actions. But a larger part of me felt nothing but indifference toward the woman who had tried to steal my life. "What did you tell Agent Martinez?" I told her I'd discuss it with you, but that the decision was entirely yours. "You don't owe Winter anything, Marcia. Not forgiveness, not closure, not even acknowledgement." I thought about the Winter I'd known. The woman who had sat at my dinner table and called me deadweight while secretly planning to drug me and steal my inheritance. Then I thought about the Winter in prison now, probably realizing for the first time that her actions had real consequences. "I don't want to see her," I said finally. "I don't want to hear her apology, and I don't want to give her the opportunity to manipulate me one more time. She's part of my past now, and I want to keep her there." Harold nodded. "I'll call Agent Martinez and let her know." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, I realized that this was what true freedom felt like. Not just the freedom that came from having financial security, though Aunt Lucille's inheritance had certainly provided that, but the freedom that came from choosing who deserved access to my time, my energy, and my love. Winter had tried to take away my choices, but in the end, she had given me the greatest choice of all. The choice to walk away from toxicity and toward the people who truly valued me. 3 months later, Trevor and Sarah announced their engagement. They wanted a small ceremony in the backyard of the Portland house, surrounded by family and close friends. As I helped Sarah choose flowers for the reception tables, I marveled at how different this felt from Trevor's first wedding. There was no drama, no manipulation, no hidden agendas, just two people who loved each other planning a celebration with people who loved them both. Sarah insisted that I help her choose her wedding dress. And when we found the perfect one, she hugged me and said, "I'm so lucky to have you as my mother-in-law." The word lucky struck me as significant. Sarah felt lucky to be joining our family, while Winter had seen us as marks to be exploited. The difference in perspective made all the difference in the world. On the morning of the wedding, I stood in the same kitchen where I'd watched my son and husband build the deck where the ceremony would take place. The house was filled with the sounds of happy preparation. Sarah and her bridesmaids laughing as they got ready upstairs, Harold and Trevor hanging lights in the backyard caterers, arranging tables and chairs. I thought about Aunt Lucille, who had been wise enough to protect her gift to me with legal safeguards that prevented Winter from stealing it. I thought about Harold, who had been patient and thorough in documenting Winter's lies until he had enough evidence to expose her. I thought about Trevor, who had found the courage to choose truth over the comfort of believing familiar lies. Most of all, I thought about myself. The woman who had sat in her living room 6 months ago, listening to her daughter-in-law call her deadweight, who had almost accepted that she was a burden on her own family. That woman felt like a stranger to me now. "You look beautiful, Mom," Trevor said, appearing in the kitchen doorway in his wedding suit. "You look happy," I replied, and I meant it. The guilt and self-doubt that had haunted him for months after Winter's arrest had finally faded, replaced by the quiet confidence of a man who knew he was loved and valued. "I'm happy," he said simply. "For the first time in years, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be with the people I'm supposed to be with." As guests began to arrive for the ceremony, I took my place in the front row of chairs Harold and Trevor had arranged on the deck. The setting was perfect. Flower arrangements from the garden we'd restored. Twinkling lights strung between the trees and the warmth of genuine love filling the space. When Sarah appeared in her wedding dress walking down the aisle, created by our chairs, I saw Trevor's face light up with pure joy. This was what love looked like when it wasn't poisoned by hidden agendas or tainted by manipulation. This was what family looked like when it was built on truth instead of lies. As they exchanged vows, promising to support each other's dreams and respect each other's families, I felt a profound sense of completion. Winter had tried to destroy our family bonds, but she had failed. We were stronger now, more appreciative of what we had, more protective of what mattered most. The reception lasted long into the evening, filled with toasts and laughter and the kind of uncomplicated happiness that Winter had never brought to our family gatherings. As the last guests departed and we cleaned up the remnants of the celebration, I realized that this house had already fulfilled its purpose. It had become exactly what I had envisioned, a place where our family could gather, where love could grow stronger, where the future looked bright with possibility. Harold found me sitting alone on the deck, watching the stars and reflecting on how much had changed since that terrible afternoon when Winter had tried to steal my life. "Any regrets?" he asked, settling into the chair beside me. I considered the question seriously. About Winter. About the pain she caused. About the time we lost to her lies. About any of it. I shook my head slowly. No regrets. What Winter did to us was terrible, but it also showed us what we're capable of when we protect each other. It reminded us that family isn't about obligation or guilt or control. It's about choice. And every day I choose you and Trevor, and now Sarah, just like you, all choose me. Harold reached over and took my hand. The same gesture that had sustained us through 43 years of marriage, including the darkest months when Winter had almost succeeded in tearing us apart. "I love you, Marcia Hutchkins," he said quietly. "I love you too." "Harold Hutchkins," I replied, and meant it more than I ever had before. In the distance, I could hear the gentle sounds of the city settling into sleep. But here on Aunt Lucille's deck, surrounded by evidence of love triumphant over lies, I felt completely at peace. Winter was in prison paying the price for her crimes. Trevor was happily married to a woman who valued family as much as he did. Harold and I had a future filled with grandchildren to spoil and memories to make. Most importantly, I had learned the difference between being wanted and being needed, between love and manipulation, between family and exploitation. Those lessons had come at a high price, but they had also given me something precious. The absolute certainty that I deserved better than what Winter had tried to give me. And now, surrounded by the people who truly loved me in a house that represented hope instead of deception, I finally had it. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.